The stars stretched endlessly before the exploration ship as it drifted through the outer regions of human space. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair and watched the displays with tired eyes. 3 months of surveying empty space had worn down his crew's enthusiasm. They were supposed to be looking for new planets to colonize, but so far they had found nothing but rocks and ice. The ship moved slowly through an asteroid field that looked like 1,000 others they had already mapped. Jake was about to order another jump to the next sector when his science officer suddenly sat up straight in her chair. Lieutenant Amy Wells stared at her screen with an expression that Jake had never seen on her face before. She looked like someone who had just seen a ghost. Jake walked over to her station and glanced at the readings. At first he saw nothing unusual, just another large asteroid with the normal mix of iron and nickel that made up most space rocks. But then Amy pointed to a series of numbers that made no sense at all. The asteroid was hollow. Not naturally hollow, but carved out with precision that spoke of intelligent design. And the metal signatures coming from inside were not natural formations. They were manufactured alloys that matched human industrial standards. That should have been impossible because humans had only been in space for 300 years, and this asteroid field was far older than that. Jake felt his heart start to beat faster in his chest. He told Amy to run a full-spectrum analysis of the entire field. The results came back in less than a minute, and they changed everything. There were 200 similar structures hidden throughout the asteroid field. Each one was carefully camouflaged to look like natural space debris. Each one contained technology that read as human in origin, and each one was impossibly old. Amy ran the carbon dating protocols 3 times because she could not believe the first 2 results. The structures were over 50,000 years old. They had been built at a time when humanity was supposed to be living in caves and hunting with stone tools on Earth. Jake stood very still and tried to process what he was seeing. There was only one possible explanation. Humans had been in space before, long before, and somehow that entire chapter of history had been completely erased from all records and memory. He thought about what this meant for humanity's place in the galaxy. The Galactic Council had always treated humans like children. They restricted human expansion and limited trade rights. They said humans were too young and too aggressive to be trusted with real power. But what if humanity was not young at all? Jake made his decision quickly. He ordered his communications officer to send an encrypted message directly to Fleet Command with the highest priority code. Then he ordered the ship to begin detailed scans of the nearest structure. If humanity had built these things, then maybe they still worked. Maybe they held answers to questions that humans did not even know to ask. The message reached Earth 3 days later and caused immediate chaos in the halls of government. Scientists argued with historians. Military officials demanded access to the sites. Politicians worried about what the Galactic Council would do if they found out about this discovery. Admiral Helen Drake took command of the situation with the kind of calm authority that had made her the youngest fleet commander in human history. She ordered complete secrecy around the discovery. No information would be shared with anyone outside of the highest levels of human government. She assembled teams of engineers and archaeologists and sent them out to the asteroid field under military escort. The first structure they opened was a shipyard. The facility stretched for 10 kilometers through the hollowed-out asteroid. Manufacturing equipment filled vast chambers. Assembly lines stood ready to begin production. Everything was covered in dust and the lights were dark, but the systems responded when the engineers connected portable power units. Dr. Laura Bennett led the archaeological team that explored deeper into the facility. She found storage areas filled with equipment, barracks that could house thousands of workers, command centers with computer systems that still held data after 50,000 years. And in the heart of the complex, she found something that made her hands shake as she read it. A message from the past. The holographic recording activated when Laura touched the control panel. A woman appeared in the air before her. She wore a uniform that looked similar to modern military dress but with subtle differences in design. She looked human in every way. She looked tired and sad. The woman in the recording spoke in a language that took the translation computers several minutes to decode. When they finally cracked it, the message was clear and terrifying. Humanity had been the dominant power in the galaxy 50,000 years ago. They had built an empire that controlled 10,000 worlds. Their fleets numbered in the millions. They had technology that made them nearly invincible. and then they had chosen to give it all up. The woman explained that humanity had faced a threat so terrible that the only way to survive was to hide. Not in space, but in their own past. They had systematically destroyed their own civilization. They had reduced themselves to primitive tribes. They had erased all records of what they had been. And they had done it willingly because they believed it was the only way their species would survive. But they had left these facilities hidden and waiting. They had left the knowledge intact for future generations to find. They had left instructions on how to rebuild everything they had lost, because they knew that someday the threat might return, and when it did, humanity would need to remember what they truly were. Laura watched the message 3 times before she believed it. Then she sent it to Admiral Drake with shaking hands. The discovery changed everything humans thought they knew about themselves. Within weeks, more facilities were located across human space. Ancient shipyards, weapons platforms, manufacturing complexes, all of them dormant and waiting, all of them ready to be awakened. Admiral Drake assembled the leaders of humanity in secret. She showed them the evidence. She played them the message from their ancient ancestors. And she asked them a simple question: what should humanity do with this knowledge? Some argued for caution. They wanted to study the facility slowly and carefully. They worried about what would happen if they moved too quickly. But others saw an opportunity. The Galactic Council had kept humanity contained for centuries. They had denied every request for expansion. They treated humans like dangerous animals that needed to be caged. But now humanity had the chance to change that. They had the means to build a fleet that would make the Council think twice about restricting human rights. They could reclaim the place in the galaxy that their ancestors had abandoned so long ago. The debate lasted for hours, but in the end, the decision was unanimous. Humanity would wake the sleeping giants. They would rebuild the fleet. They would prepare in secret. And when they were ready, they would show the galaxy that humans were not children to be managed. They were the inheritors of an ancient legacy. They were warriors who had chosen peace once but could choose war if pushed too far. The asteroid field that humans now called Site Alpha became the busiest place in the galaxy within 3 months of the initial discovery. Thousands of workers arrived every day on unmarked transport ships. Security was tight enough to make a prison look relaxed. Every person who entered the site signed documents that promised severe punishment for any leak of information. The Galactic Council could not be allowed to know what was happening here. Commander Peter Hayes stood in the main control room of the primary shipyard and watched his engineers work. The facility was slowly coming back to life after 50,000 years of sleep. Lights flickered on in sections that had been dark since before human civilization began. Computer systems that had been designed by ancestors nobody remembered were responding to commands from their descendants. The scale of what they had found still made Peter's head spin when he thought about it too hard. This single shipyard was larger than any space station humanity had ever built. The manufacturing bays could construct hundreds of ships at the same time. The material storage areas held enough raw resources to build a fleet that could darken the stars. And this was just one of 73 identical facilities scattered across human space. Chief Engineer Lisa Chen walked up to him with a tablet in her hands and an expression of disbelief on her face. She had been working 18-hour days trying to understand the ancient systems. Peter could see the exhaustion in her eyes, but he also saw excitement that no amount of tiredness could hide. Lisa showed him the latest progress reports. The power generation systems were now running at 60% capacity. The molecular assemblers that could build ship components at the atomic level were calibrated and ready. The automated mining drones that would feed raw materials into the facility had been awakened and were already processing asteroids. Everything was ahead of schedule. Peter asked the question that mattered most: how long until they could start building ships? Lisa smiled for the first time in weeks. 2 days. They could begin production in 2 days. The ancient artificial intelligence that ran the shipyard had walked them through every system. It had answered every question. It had even suggested improvements based on 50,000 years of stored research that humanity had never been able to access. But Lisa's smile faded when she showed Peter the next part of her report. The production capabilities were beyond anything she had imagined possible. Once the shipyard reached full operational capacity, it could produce 100 warships every single day. The ships would be built to ancient specifications that made modern human vessels look like toys. They would have weapons that could crack planets, armor that could shrug off anything the Galactic Council's fleets could throw at them, speed that would let them cross the galaxy in weeks instead of months. Multiply that by 73 shipyards and humanity could build more than 5,000 warships per day. In a month, they could have a fleet of 150,000 ships. In 3 months, they could have 500,000. The numbers were so large they lost meaning. Peter understood the magnitude of what they were about to unleash on the galaxy. But he also understood why it was necessary. The Galactic Council had kept humanity locked in a cage for 3 centuries. They had limited human expansion to 15 colony worlds. They had restricted human trade to a handful of approved partners. They had done everything possible to keep humanity weak and contained. The Council claimed they did this for everyone's safety. They said humans were too aggressive and too unpredictable to be trusted with real power. But Peter knew the truth. The Council was afraid. They had seen what humans could do even with limited resources. They had watched human innovation and creativity solve problems that other species had given up on centuries ago. They knew that if humans were ever allowed to reach their full potential, they would reshape the galaxy. Now humanity was about to prove them right. Across human space, the preparations continued in secret. Every colony world contributed workers to the project. Retired military personnel came out of retirement to help train new crews. Ship captains studied ancient tactical manuals that described fleet movements on scales that made modern naval doctrine look primitive. Scientists pored over technical specifications for weapons and defensive systems that seemed like magic. The artificial intelligence systems left by their ancestors proved to be invaluable teachers. They had been programmed with the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that had ruled the galaxy. They knew things about physics and engineering that modern humans had never even theorized. They shared this knowledge freely with anyone who asked. It was like having access to a library that contained every secret of the universe. Admiral Drake visited Site Alpha 6 weeks after production had begun. She walked through the manufacturing bays and watched ships take shape before her eyes. The molecular assemblers worked with precision that seemed impossible. They built components one atom at a time, but moved so fast that entire hull sections materialized in hours. Automated systems moved the pieces into position and welded them together, with techniques that left no seams or weak points. The ships themselves were beautiful in a way that modern human vessels had never been. They had smooth lines that suggested speed and power. Their hulls were dark and absorbed sensor scans instead of reflecting them. Their weapons were integrated into the design so seamlessly that they looked like part of the ship's structure rather than additions. These were warships built by people who had perfected the art of war over thousands of years. Drake met with the facility commanders and reviewed the production schedules. They were building 10 different classes of ships, ranging from small destroyers to massive dreadnoughts that stretched 3 kilometers from bow to stern. Each class had been designed for specific roles in fleet combat. The ancient humans had understood combined arms warfare on a level that made modern military theory look like children playing with toy soldiers. The question that nobody wanted to ask but everyone was thinking about finally came up. During the command meeting, what were they going to do with all these ships once they were built? Drake had been preparing for this question since the day the first facility was discovered. She laid out the plan that she and the civilian leadership had developed. Humanity would build a fleet of 10,000 warships. That number was large enough to make an overwhelming statement, but small enough that they could crew the vessels with trained personnel. They would keep the fleet hidden until the right moment came. That moment would be the next Galactic Council meeting, where humanity's petition for expanded colonization rights was scheduled to be discussed. The Council had already indicated they would deny the petition. They had made it clear they had no intention of ever allowing humanity more freedom. That was when humanity would reveal what they had been building. Drake emphasized that this was not going to be an act of war. No shots would be fired. No threats would be made. Humanity would simply appear at the council meeting with 10,000 warships and politely request that their petition be reconsidered. The message would be clear without anyone having to say it out loud. Humanity was done asking for permission. The commanders understood their orders. Build the ships. Train the crews. Maintain absolute secrecy. And be ready to move when the signal came. Production continued at an incredible pace. The shipyards ran 24 hours a day. New facilities came online every week as more ancient sites were discovered and reactivated. The fleet grew by hundreds of ships every day. Supply chains were established to provide fuel and ammunition. Logistics officers worked out the complex planning required to move 10,000 warships across the galaxy simultaneously. And through it all, the Galactic Council remained completely unaware. They continued to debate humanity's place in the galaxy. They made their political calculations and formed their alliances. They worried about minor trade disputes and border disagreements. They had no idea that the balance of power in the galaxy was about to shift forever. Peter stood in the observation bay and watched another dreadnought slide out of the construction dock. The ship was massive and powerful and beautiful. It represented the resurrection of humanity's true heritage. It was proof that humans were not the young and weak species the Council believed them to be. He thought about the message from their ancestors, the warning about the threat that had forced humanity to hide. Nobody knew what that threat was. The ancient records gave no details, but Peter suspected they were about to find out if humanity's show of force attracted the wrong kind of attention. For now, though, that was a problem for another day. Today was about building the fleet that would change everything. The date had been set 3 months in advance. The Galactic Council would meet on HFY to discuss various petitions and disputes from member species. Humanity's request for expanded colonization rights was listed third on the agenda. Nobody expected it to take more than an hour of debate before the Council denied the petition like they had denied every other. Human request for the past century, Ambassador. Claire Davis prepared for the meeting in her quarters aboard the diplomatic transport. She had been humanity's voice to the galaxy for 5 years. She had endured countless insults and dismissals. She had watched the Council representatives treat her like a child who needed to be educated about how the real galaxy worked. She had smiled through it all and maintained her diplomatic composure even when every fiber of her being wanted to scream at the arrogance of the elder races. Today that would change. Claire reviewed her speech one final time. It was short and simple. She would make humanity's case for expansion. She would cite the legal precedents and point out the inconsistencies in how the Council applied its rules. The Council would ignore all of it and vote to deny the petition. And then Claire would give a signal that would alter the course of galactic history. The diplomatic transport approached HFY right on schedule. The planet was beautiful from orbit with its blue oceans and green continents. It had been chosen as the Council's neutral meeting ground precisely because no species had ever claimed it. The massive space station that orbited the planet housed the Council chambers and provided accommodation for thousands of delegates from across the galaxy. Claire's ship docked with the station and she made her way to the Council chambers with her small staff. They walked through corridors filled with representatives from hundreds of different species. Some looked vaguely humanoid. Others were so alien that Claire's mind had trouble processing their physical forms. All of them wore expressions of boredom when they noticed the human delegation passing by. The Council chamber itself was designed to inspire awe. The ceiling was a transparent dome that showed the stars above. Seating was arranged in concentric circles with the most powerful species at the center, and the minor species relegated to the outer rings. Humanity's seats were in the second-to-last row. Only a handful of species were considered less important than humans. High Chancellor Vexthur called the meeting to order. The Krauth was 3 meters tall with scaled skin and eyes that looked like they belonged to a predator. His species had been part of the Council for over 10,000 years. They considered themselves the guardians of galactic order and treated younger species with barely concealed contempt. The first 2 items on the agenda passed quickly. Minor trade agreements that nobody really cared about. Then Vexthur announced that the Council would now hear the human petition for expanded colonization rights. Claire stood and walked to the speaker's platform at the center of the chamber. She felt the eyes of hundreds of delegates on her. Most of them had already made up their minds about how they would vote. This speech was just a formality that had to be endured before they could move on to more important matters. Claire began speaking. She laid out humanity's case with facts and logic. She pointed out that humans had proven themselves to be responsible colonizers. She noted that human population growth required additional living space. She reminded the Council that every other species at humanity's stage of development had been granted similar expansion rights. The delegates listened with expressions of polite boredom. A few didn't even bother to hide their yawns. When Claire finished speaking, Vexthur thanked her for her presentation and called for the vote without allowing any debate. The result was exactly what everyone expected. 412 delegates voted to deny the petition. Only 17 voted in favor. Those 17 were all from younger species who had also experienced the Council's restrictive policies. Vexthur announced the result with barely concealed satisfaction. The human petition was denied. Humanity would not be granted expanded colonization rights at this time. Perhaps in another century they could submit a new request. Claire nodded slowly. She had expected this outcome. She had prepared for it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small communicator. She pressed a single button. High above HFY, the fleet that had been hiding beyond sensor range received the signal. 10,000 warships activated their engines simultaneously. They moved as one toward the planet with precision that spoke of countless hours of training. Their formation was perfect. Their spacing was exact. They came in fast and silent like shadows sweeping across the stars. Inside the council chamber, the first sign that something was wrong came when the stars visible through the transparent dome began to disappear. Delegates looked up in confusion as the view of space was slowly blocked out. The darkness spread like a wave rolling across the sky. Ships. Thousands of ships. More ships than most of the delegates had ever seen in one place. They formed a sphere around HFY that blocked out the light from the distant sun. The council chamber grew darker as more and more vessels moved into position overhead. The chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates shouted in hundreds of different languages. Security officers drew weapons and looked around frantically for a threat. Computer systems triggered every alarm as they tried to process what their sensors were telling them. Claire remained calm at the speaker's platform. She waited for the noise to die down. When it didn't, she simply started talking. Her voice cut through the confusion with the kind of authority that came from knowing you held all the cards. She told the council that they were looking at 10,000 human warships. She explained that these vessels were built using technology from humanity's ancient past. She noted that each ship was more powerful than anything currently in the council's fleet. And she made it very clear that this was not an act of war. This was a negotiation. Claire walked slowly around the speaker's platform as she talked. She explained that humanity had discovered the truth about their own history. They had learned that 50,000 years ago humans had been the dominant power in the galaxy. They had chosen to step back and let other species rise, but that did not mean humanity had given up their right to exist as equals. Vexthur found his voice and demanded that the humans stand down immediately. He called this an act of aggression that the council would not tolerate. He threatened military action and economic sanctions and expulsion from every galactic institution. Claire listened to his threats with a small smile. When he finished, she simply pointed up at the dome, where the human fleet had completely darkened the sky. She asked Vexthur a simple question. What military action did he think the council could take against this? The silence that followed was deafening. Claire continued her speech. She said that humanity did not want war. They did not want to conquer or subjugate anyone. They simply wanted to be treated as equals. They wanted the same rights that every other species enjoyed. They wanted to be able to expand and grow and develop without arbitrary restrictions imposed by species who viewed them as children. She proposed a new galactic charter, one that would give every species equal representation, regardless of how long they had been traveling in space. One that would base decisions on merit and need rather than age and tradition. One that would recognize that the galaxy belonged to all its inhabitants, not just the elder races who had appointed themselves as rulers. The delegates listened in stunned silence. Some looked angry. Others looked frightened. But Claire noticed something interesting. A significant number of the delegates from younger species were nodding in agreement. They had also suffered under the council's restrictions. They had also been dismissed and ignored and treated like they didn't matter. Vexthur tried to regain control of the meeting. He declared that the council would not negotiate under threat. He said that humanity would face consequences for this action. He demanded that the human fleet withdraw immediately. Claire's response was calm and measured. The fleet would stay exactly where it was until the council agreed to consider the new charter. Humanity was done asking for permission. They were done being treated as inferiors. The elder races could either accept that the galaxy had changed, or they could try to fight it. But Claire strongly advised against the latter option. She pointed out that the human fleet surrounding Axis Prime was just a fraction of what humanity could build if pushed. The ancient facilities were still producing ships. The shipyards were running at full capacity. If the Council chose war, then humanity would give them war on a scale that the galaxy had not seen in 50,000 years. But if the Council chose peace and cooperation, then humanity would be the galaxy's strongest ally. Humans had always valued friendship and partnership. They had always tried to work within the system. They had only been forced to take this dramatic action because all other options had been exhausted. The choice was the Council's to make. Claire walked back to her seat and sat down. The chamber remained silent for a long moment. Every delegate was processing what had just happened. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in the span of minutes. The humans, who had always been treated as a minor species, had just revealed themselves to be something else entirely. The 3 days of recess became the most politically active period in modern galactic history. Delegates rushed back and forth between meetings. Communication channels burned with encrypted traffic as governments consulted with advisors and military leaders. Everyone wanted to know the same things. How had humanity built such a fleet in secret? What else were they capable of? And most importantly, what should the galaxy do about it? Admiral Helen Drake commanded the human fleet from her flagship positioned at the center of the formation above Axis Prime. The ship was called Liberty, and it was one of the ancient dreadnought designs. 3 kilometers of armor and weapons that could reduce a planet to rubble. The flag bridge gave her a view of the entire fleet arrayed around her. 10,000 ships holding position with machine precision. Drake spent the recess period managing what she privately thought of as the most complex military standoff in history. Multiple Council species had moved their own fleets into the system. They maintained careful distances and broadcasting peaceful intentions, but everyone knew how quickly that could change. One nervous commander making one stupid decision and the galaxy would be at war. So Drake kept her ships on high alert but with weapons safed. She broadcast constant assurances that humanity had no hostile intent. She allowed Council observers to approach close enough to scan the human vessels, though she suspected they didn't like what their sensors were telling them. The human ships were simply better, more advanced, more powerful, more dangerous. The Council military commanders could do the math. Even if every species combined their fleets, they would be outnumbered. And the technological advantage that humanity possessed meant the actual combat power disparity was even worse. Any war with humanity would be short and brutal and end with human victory. That reality shaped everything that happened during the recess. Back on Earth, the human government debated their next moves. Some officials wanted to push for maximum advantage while they had the Council backed into a corner. Others counseled restraint and warned about overplaying their hand. President Nathan Cross listened to all the arguments and then made his decision. Humanity would stick to their original proposal. Equal representation for all species. No conquest. No subjugation. Just fairness. Cross understood that this moment would define humanity's role in the galaxy for centuries to come. If they used their military advantage to bully other species, then they would be no better than the Council they were trying to reform. But if they demonstrated wisdom and restraint, along with their strength, then they had a chance to build something better. Meanwhile, the younger species in the Council were having very different conversations with their governments. Many of them had suffered under the same restrictions that had been imposed on humanity. They had watched the elder races make decisions that benefited themselves while claiming to act for the good of all. They had been denied opportunities and told to be patient and wait their turn. Now suddenly they had an ally powerful enough to challenge the old order. Representatives from 23 younger species formed a coalition and drafted their own proposals for reforming the Council. They reached out to the human delegation and offered support. Together, they represented almost a third of the Council's membership. Add in a few of the more progressive elder species, and they might actually have enough votes to pass real reforms. The elder races were having much more difficult discussions. Species like the Krauth had dominated the Council for thousands of years. They had grown comfortable with their power and privileges. The thought of giving up that position to accommodate humans and other younger species was almost incomprehensible to them. But they also understood military reality. High Chancellor Vexther received briefing after briefing from his military commanders. Each one told him the same thing. The Krauth fleet could not defeat the humans alone. Even a combined council force would suffer terrible casualties. And all of this assumed the 10,000 ships above HFY were all that humanity had. The intelligence report suggested there were many more being built. Some of the elder species wanted to fight anyway. Pride and tradition meant more to them than practical considerations. But cooler heads prevailed when they started running simulations of what an actual war would look like. The projections were horrifying. Entire species could be wiped out. Colonies that had existed for millennia could be reduced to ash. The galactic economy would collapse, and for what? To maintain a system that had already failed. To keep younger species suppressed. To preserve pride at the cost of survival. When the council reconvened after 3 days, the mood in the chamber was completely different from before. The casual arrogance of the elder races had been replaced by wariness. The younger species no longer looked defeated and resigned, and the human delegation sat in their seats with quiet confidence. Vexthor called the session to order and acknowledged that the council had spent the recess period reviewing the human proposal. He said that many delegates had concerns and questions. He invited discussion before any vote was taken. What followed was 12 hours of debate. The elder species tried to water down the reforms. They proposed compromise versions that would give younger species slightly more representation, while preserving most of the existing power structure. The younger species coalition rejected these attempts and held firm on their demands for real equality. Claire spoke twice during the debates. Both times she kept her remarks short and focused. She emphasized that humanity was not trying to seize power for themselves. They wanted a system that was fair to everyone. She pointed out that the current structure had failed to prevent the very situation they now found themselves in. If the council had treated humanity fairly from the beginning, then none of this would have been necessary. Several delegates from elder species made veiled threats about the consequences of forcing through unwanted changes. Claire responded by noting that humanity's fleet was still in position overhead. She wasn't threatening. She was simply stating facts. The galaxy had changed. The old order was gone. They could either adapt or become irrelevant. As the debate wore on, it became clear that the coalition of younger species, plus a few reform-minded elder species, had the votes they needed. The old guard could filibuster and delay, but they couldn't stop the inevitable. The new charter would pass. Vexthor finally called for the vote near the end of the session. He looked tired and defeated. His species had ruled the council for 10,000 years. That era was ending, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The vote was closer than expected. 297 in favor, 115 opposed, 8 abstentions. The new galactic charter was adopted. The chamber erupted in noise as delegates processed what had just happened. Some celebrated, others sat in stunned silence. A few representatives from the most conservative elder species simply stood and walked out. Claire remained in her seat and allowed herself a small smile. They had done it. Humanity had changed the galaxy without firing a shot. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Implementing the new charter would take years. There would be resistance and setbacks. Some species would never accept the new order and would work to undermine it at every opportunity. But the foundation had been laid. The younger species now had real representation. Decisions would be made based on merit rather than tradition. The galaxy was taking its first steps toward genuine equality. Admiral Drake received word of the vote from Claire and immediately issued new orders to the fleet. The ships began a carefully choreographed withdrawal from HFY. They moved slowly and in perfect formation. Drake wanted to show that humanity could project power, but also knew when to pull back. The message was important. We are strong, but not aggressive. We can destroy you, but choose not to. The human fleet jumped away in groups of 1,000. Each jump was precisely timed and executed flawlessly. Within 6 hours, HFY was clear, and the stars were visible again through the council chamber dome. But nobody who had been in that chamber would ever forget the sight of 10,000 human warships darkening the sky. That image would shape galactic politics for generations to come. Drake ordered the fleet to disperse to patrol routes across human space. Some ships would be stationed near the border between human territory and potentially hostile neighbors. Others would conduct goodwill visits to allied species. A reserve force would remain at the secret shipyards ready to deploy if needed. The admiral sat in her command chair and watched the fleet execute her orders with professional precision. These ships and crews had accomplished something remarkable. They had demonstrated that humanity was ready to take its place as a major power. They had shown strength without brutality. They had achieved their objectives through deterrence rather than destruction. Drake thought about the message from humanity's ancient ancestors, the warning about the threat that had forced humanity to hide. She wondered if that threat was still out there somewhere, and she wondered if, by revealing humanity's strength, they had just painted a target on themselves. But those were worries for another day. Today was about celebrating a victory that had been earned through careful planning and bold action. 6 months after the revelation at Axis Prime, the galaxy looked very different. The new charter had been implemented with surprising speed. The council chambers had been reorganized to give every species equal seating. Decisions were now made through genuine debate rather than dictates from the elder races. Species that had been ignored for centuries suddenly found their voices heard and their concerns addressed. Admiral Helen Drake stood in the observation deck of Unity Station and watched ships from a dozen different species dock with the facility. This was humanity's new diplomatic headquarters built in neutral space halfway between human territory and the Council core worlds. The station symbolized humanity's new role in the galaxy. Not conquerors, not rulers, but partners and equals. President Nathan Cross joined Drake at the viewing window. He had flown out from Earth to attend the dedication ceremony for the station. His presence demonstrated how seriously humanity was taking their new responsibilities in galactic affairs. Cross commented on how much had changed in such a short time. The council that had once dismissed every human request now consulted humanity on major decisions. Species that had looked down on humans now sought alliances and partnerships. The elder races that had tried to keep humanity contained now competed for favorable relations with the newest major power. Drake agreed, but also noted that not everyone was happy with the changes. Some of the more conservative species still resented humanity's rise. There had been 3 attempted terror attacks on human facilities in the past month. Nothing successful, but enough to show that resistance to the new order existed. Security remained a priority. The conversation turned to the question that had been on everyone's mind since the ancient facilities were discovered. What had humanity's ancestors been running from? The archaeological teams had now excavated over 200 sites. They had found incredible technology and detailed records of the ancient empire, but they had found almost nothing about the threat that had forced humanity to regress. The message from the past mentioned it only vaguely. Something terrible, something that could not be defeated through military force alone, something that required humanity to hide so completely that they erased their own history. Dr. Laura Bennett had become the leading expert on ancient human civilization. She had spent 6 months poring over every fragment of data recovered from the facilities. She joined Drake and Cross at the observation deck and shared her latest findings. Laura explained that the ancient records showed humanity had been exploring beyond the galactic rim 50,000 years ago. They had sent expeditions to nearby dwarf galaxies and even to the intergalactic void. One of those expeditions had encountered something. The records went silent after that. No details about what they found. Just a sudden shift in humanity's entire civilization. Within a decade of that final expedition, the ancient humans had begun dismantling their empire. They closed the shipyards. They abandoned their colonies. They systematically destroyed their own technology, and they developed a plan to reduce humanity to a pre-technological state. It was the most dramatic act of civilizational suicide ever recorded. Laura believed the threat must have been truly extraordinary to force such desperate measures. Something that could track advanced civilizations, something that was attracted to powerful species. The only way to survive was to become invisible by becoming primitive. Cross asked the obvious question. Was the threat still out there? Laura said she didn't know. 50,000 years was a long time. Maybe whatever scared their ancestors was long gone, or maybe it was still out there waiting for humanity to make themselves visible again. By building the fleet and revealing their capabilities, humanity might have just announced their presence to something very dangerous. Drake acknowledged the risk but noted they had not really had a choice. The Galactic Council was never going to give humanity the room to grow peacefully. They had to demonstrate strength or be kept in a cage forever. If that attracted unwanted attention, then they would deal with it when the time came. The three of them watched as a transport from the Krauth homeworld approached the station. High Chancellor Vexther was aboard. He had requested this meeting personally. Drake suspected he wanted to negotiate some kind of understanding with humanity, now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. The meeting took place in one of Unity Station's conference rooms. Vexther arrived with a small staff and looked uncomfortable in the egalitarian setting. He was used to towering over other species and using his physical presence to intimidate, but Drake stood her ground and cross-greeted him with polite courtesy that somehow made the power difference even more clear. Vexther got straight to business. The Krauth had been the dominant military power in the Council for 10,000 years. That dominance was now gone. Humanity had more ships and better technology. The balance of power had shifted. The Krauth needed to know what humanity's intentions were. Cross responded with practiced diplomacy. Humanity had no territorial ambitions beyond the colony worlds they had already requested. They were not interested in conquest or domination. They simply wanted to be treated fairly and allowed to develop naturally. If the Krauth could accept that, then there was no reason the two species couldn't coexist peacefully. Vexther asked about the human fleet. How many ships did humanity actually have? The 10,000 at Axis Prime had changed everything, but intelligence suggested humanity was still building more. How large would the fleet eventually become? Drake fielded that question. She explained that humanity was maintaining a fleet of 20,000 warships for defensive purposes. The ancient shipyards were still operational, but production had been scaled back significantly. Humanity was building enough to ensure their security, but not so many that they would terrify their neighbors. It was a balance between deterrence and reassurance. The Chancellor seemed relieved by that answer. 20,000 was still an overwhelming force, but at least it was a finite number. The Krauth had feared humanity might build a fleet of hundreds of thousands or even millions. That would have made every other species in the galaxy obsolete. The meeting continued for another hour, covering trade agreements and security cooperation. Vexther was clearly trying to position the Krauth as humanity's primary partner among the elder races. He offered military exercises and intelligence sharing. He suggested joint patrols along the galactic rim where piracy had become a problem. Cross and Drake listened carefully and made no commitments. They would consider the proposals and respond through proper channels. The meeting ended cordially enough, though nobody was under any illusions about the underlying dynamic. The Krauth were adapting to their new position in the galactic hierarchy. They were smart enough to realize that opposing humanity would be futile, so they were trying to make themselves useful. Instead, after Vexther departed, Cross commented that they would be receiving many similar overtures in the coming months. Every major species would want to establish relationships with humanity. Some would be genuine offers of partnership. Others would be attempts to manipulate or influence human policy. Sorting out which was which would be one of the great challenges ahead. Drake agreed, but noted that humanity had advantages the elder races didn't fully appreciate. 300 years of being dismissed and underestimated had taught humans to be careful observers. They had learned to read the subtle currents of galactic politics. They understood how the elder races thought and operated. That knowledge would serve them well. The dedication ceremony for Unity Station took place the following day. Representatives from over 100 species attended. It was the largest diplomatic gathering since the Council vote on the new charter. Everyone wanted to see humanity's new facility and get a sense of how humans would exercise their newfound power. Ambassador Claire Davis gave the keynote speech. She talked about partnership and cooperation. She emphasized that humanity saw themselves as part of the galactic community, not as rulers over it. She invited all species to work together to build a better future, and she reminded everyone that the galaxy had changed because the old system had failed. The new system would only succeed if everyone committed to making it work. The speech was well received. Several younger species delegates approached Claire afterward to thank her personally. They said humanity had given them hope that meaningful change was possible. For the first time in their histories, they felt like their species mattered. Drake watched the ceremony from the sidelines and felt a sense of satisfaction. This was what they had been fighting for. Not dominance, but equality. Not conquest, but cooperation. Humanity had the power to reshape the galaxy through force, but they were choosing to do it through example. Instead, later that evening, Drake received a priority message from one of the deep space monitoring stations. A sensor anomaly had been detected beyond the galactic rim. It was faint and intermittent. It might be nothing, but the signature was unlike anything in the database. Drake felt a chill run down her spine. She thought about Laura's research into humanity's ancient past, the expedition beyond the rim, the threat that had forced humanity to hide. 50,000 years was a long time, but some things might endure longer than anyone expected.